Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Orbit Live event. I'm delighted to be joined by Constance Sayers and Rena Rossner, two fantastic authors of historical fantasy. Constance Sayers is the author of A Witch in Time and her new novel, The Ladies of the Secret Circus, out now from Red Hook. Rena Rossner is the author of The Sisters of the Winter Wood and her new novel, The Light of the Midnight Stars, which Red Hook will be publishing this coming week. If you haven't already picked the books up, click on the green button at the bottom of the screen that says Buy Constance and Rena's Books. You can also find links to their Twitter accounts there. Constance and Rena will be talking about their books, but they'll also be answering your questions in this event. Click on the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen to add a question to the list, or vote on the questions that have already been submitted by other attendees. They'll answer questions with the most votes first. Don't forget to follow Orbit on Crowdcast if you'd like to be notified about future Orbit Live events. And now I'm very pleased to turn things over to Constance and Rena.
Great. Oh my gosh, thank you, Ellen. That's the amazing Ellen Wright, who takes such good care of us at Red Hook and Orbit. We're so excited to be here. Rena, you've got a book coming out. I'm going to hold it up. Coming out on Tuesday, The Light of the Midnight Stars.
2 days.
I know. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about your book and give us a sneak peek?
Sure. So just like The Sisters of the Winter Wood, The Light of the Midnight Stars is what I call historical fantasy. It's also a story about sisters, 3 this time, and each of them sort of have a magical legacy in their blood that was passed down through the generations from the magic of King Solomon. And it's not a happy story. It's a bit of a tragic, sad story, but The Sisters of the Winter Wood was set in sort of 1903, Ukraine, Moldova, that region. This is much, much earlier than that. And we'll get to why that was much more of a challenge than writing Sisters of the Winter Wood. It's set in sort of medieval Hungary and an area which is now Slovakia. And there was a review that came out a little while ago from School Library Journal that said it's about dragon riding rabbis and their fire breathing daughters. And I was like, that's a rather perfect explanation. Anyway, it's also about memory and about storytelling and about legacies sort of rooted in the blood. And yeah, it has a lot in very different ways, has a lot in common with Constance's work, which is why I'm so excited that we're here talking together about both of our books. Yeah,
I know. It was a little bit of when I started reading through your book, I was like, wow, we approach it very differently. We'll get to, some topics we're going to cover like historical research and that's different, but I have all of the books. This is my new book, The Ladies of the Secret Circus. And, it does also cover sisters and magic and sisters kind of coming to terms with magic. I think one of the big differences, you have the magic from King Solomon. I have the magic from the devil. So we have a little bit of a different approach there, certainly. But yeah, it's my book is about a man who goes missing on his wedding day, and the woman who is left, Laura Barnes, realizes that there's a little bit more to the story, and he's not the first man who's gone missing, and it kind of ties to this dark circus that was taking place in Paris during the Lost Generation in 1925. And so again, as we started talking, we've talked before, there are a lot of similarities between the themes and the structures of our book, even though they take place in very different times. So
yeah. One of the things I loved about your book was how, even what you think from at the beginning of the book changes as you go through it. And, at a certain point, you even discover that someone else went missing that nobody, and then the case is sort of connected. So it's got like a bit of a mystery, but it's also got like somewhat of a pivot also in the way that the book is structured. And that also sort of reminded me of some of the things that I'm trying to do in Light of the Midnight Stars, that there's this like moment of pivot where the story sort of almost starts, right, all over again. Yeah. And I thought that was so neat. It's very much, I think both books are very much about a voyage of discovery, and you don't know what to expect next. hope that's
And
the reading experience.
Yeah, definitely, because you have a major pivot also, when they leave and go to, a different town and become and hide. And I mean, it's just, yeah. So, I mean, I definitely think, to what you just said about my book, weirdly, I think something that stuck with me from all the workshops on novel writing was that you had to have that propelling thing to kind of keep people's interest and and I really kind of took that into my bones. And so I tend to write thrillers. I mean, like I one of the biggest things that I keep hearing about my books is that they're a mashup of different genres. I think that's probably fair because I do try to take on a lot of different things. Although you take on a lot of things, you've got verse at the end. I mean, you've got a lot of things as well. I think both books are rather ambitious. Yeah. So how weird is it now to be, the last book you had was in 2018, and you were talking about you did a pretty big book tour in the real world, and like
with live human beings,
and I mean, this is kind of cool because you're 7 hours ahead in Israel. I'm in Pittsburgh right now. And so, I mean, how different has it been for you? I mean, to promote a book in a pandemic?
Yeah, well, I mean, the truth is that I kind of feel like virtual events have better attendance, which is like a weird thing to say. You never know in live events how many people are going to show up, and I definitely feel that. Yeah, I feel like there's a wider reach, and also because of my location, it sort of enabled me to reach all different types of people in all different time zones. And it's actually kind of more fun. Like more people can attend, more of the people that I want to be there. I'd have to do 20 events to have all the people in the world that I want at my events, So it's kind of neat to be able to put everybody in one place, and talk to everybody and even have this like, I don't know if Ellen mentioned, but this is going to be available even after we finish speaking. So if anybody missed it or wants to go back and look at it, and that's kind of a neat thing. On the other hand, it was fun doing a tour and being in live bookstores where people could actually like touch the books and you could talk to people in person. But it's all right, I think we're at a place in the pandemic where it is what it is, and we're not in this. Things are still terrible, but there's not the uncertainty as much. I just think that we've accepted that this is the way things are now, and maybe moving forward, hybrid model is the way to go.
I think so. I definitely, so my first book, A Witch in Time, came out February 11th last year. And it was I had like two live events, and then everything just kind of like shut down on March 16th. So I kind of got in under the wire, but I mean, it was definitely a different experience this year. I mean, I feel like I worked harder in a way. I mean, I feel like I've done a lot more. I've reached a lot more people, but I feel like, I think last week, I was mentioning I had like 5. I told Ellen, I'm like, I want to do this like massive like virtual book tour. And so Ellen got, it was massive virtual book tour. And it was like, I was exhausted by Friday. I couldn't even, I was doing cocktails on Instagram, like circus themed cocktails. Wow. You just try to do a lot more, I think, than you might have done, except I say that, and you did this amazing book tour for like a month. So I feel like such a slacker.
And I'm like, I think I'm just overwhelmed. I'm still overwhelmed. Like I have 5 kids, and I'm a literary agent, right, in my spare time. And so I think I'm just kind of a little bit more overwhelmed, and I don't know if I could do a month-long book tour now, and I don't know if I could do 10 events in a week now. So I'm doing what I'm doing, and I think that's a lot of part of it too, the whole launching a book during a pandemic. And you, man, I didn't realize that you launched 2, basically.
Yeah. And I have a full-time job. Yeah, I do have a full-time job. I don't have 5 children. I have, but I have a full-time job. I run a media company in my day job, and in Washington, D.C. And so, that has been, I mean, it's not I think we have about 150 employees now. And so, you just have to, I think probably like you have to be really disciplined. And I am much more, I scrutinize what takes my time now a lot more than I used to. I used to just say yes to everything. And, now I don't do that as much as I used to. You have to be a little bit more protective. So we are going to, so we're going to answer we're going to talk, we have one more question among ourselves, and then we're going to go to you all in the audience. You have an ask a question button. We're going to try and be, if I don't like hit that button and then like wipe myself out here, we'll try to get to that. I'm not sure I'm going to like how technically sound I am here. So, but we talked a little bit about our characters are both women coming to terms with magic. You've got Sarah and Hannah. Is it Lavana?
Mm-hmm.
And then my Laura Barnes. I mean, I think we get asked a lot, like, you know, why magic? You know, why is magic so important for, you know, why do we both, I guess the question is, why do we both write historical fantasy? And, you know, and we both have like looming darkness. Yours, you know, is you know, kind of the dragon mist,
insidiously creeping in the forest, right.
And mine, and mine's more of a family tragedy, like kind of that has dark magic underneath it. But you know, structurally, they're very similar. I mean, I think that for me, you know, the idea of like writing this, I found the Circus while I was researching Belle Epoque Paris. I kept finding the Circus, and like, you know, because they had these really cool, like Toulouse-Lautrec did a ton of paintings on the Cirque Medrano, and I kept running into these like really bizarre circus images, and I was like, wow, they're kind of cool, but they're freaky, and this narrative started coming in my head. And I remember saying to Sarah Guan, who at the time was my editor at the time, I said, you know, I think I have this idea of twin sisters in the circus, and it's a dark circus, and she was like, I really love that. Go with that. And that just kind of, you know, kind of played in the background while I was writing book one. But for me, you know, I used to never write fantasy. I was a straight up rural noir, and my writing never went anywhere as a result. And I think the minute I kind of put this like fourth dimension of fantasy, like you can have something, but then you have this like kind of like undercurrent of something else going on. I think my personal writing really lifted up, and that's when I started actually. I mean, I got an agent as a result of that, and I, you know, got a book deal as a result of that. But it was like I had to switch genres, and I had to like add magic to get magic from my writing. I don't know about you.
It's so interesting. No, I actually, well, you know, I've been a lover of fantasy my whole life. I've been reading fantasy, you know, for as early as I was able to discover fantasy, and I sort of discovered it and never left. There was a brief period in university where I thought that I should read some of like the greats, and, you know, you're in like, you know, like your MFA and you're reading like these, like, you know, very, I don't know. There's a certain just slew of books you tend to read, and both classics and modern. I don't know if you can call them classics. And then I went away from fantasy for a bit, but then I very quickly, a couple of years after university, found myself right back there. You know, I do still read literary fiction, and I do still write it. I do love books that have very lyrical language. The first two books that I wrote before Sisters of the Winterwood, both of the books were agented, and both of them went to acquisitions at various times, and neither one sold. And that was like a good solid 10 years of heartache.
Yeah.
Until I got
the same thing. Yeah.
But so I would say my first book wasn't fantastical at all, but it was in 4 perspectives, which is a thing I do. And one of the characters was in verse. And that was like well before novels in verse were even a thing. It just felt right to me. I think there are a lot more novels in verse now. It's a lot more accepted sort of a form of storytelling. Not necessarily in adult fantasy as much, but, you know, definitely in YA and in other spaces, middle grade. And then my second book, I delved a little bit more into like, it was like about Jewish stigmata, and I may go back to that book at some point. And so it had a little bit of like dark horror. And then I don't know, I think that like I had such a healthy respect, like worshipful respect for the greats of fantasy, that I was afraid to like, what can I add to the conversation? How could I possibly add me? Who am I to like, you know, write fantasy? Like, these are the people I worship and idolize. And then I don't know, with Sisters of the Winterwood, it just all sort of came together. I just was like, oh, I know what I can add to the conversation. And that was when it started. And but definitely my first 2 books were historical. So like my books, historical is really important to me. It's how I tell a story. It's actually like in university, I studied poetry and nonfiction writing. I didn't really study fiction. I didn't like fiction. Again, I think it was like that whole MFA, writing a certain type of thing that I just didn't connect to, and was not a short story writer, still not so much. And so I kind of like go about finding my topics via like finding the real story first, and then being like, okay, but what's the twist? Like, how do I make it fantastical, right? What if King Solomon had, you know, there was a legacy of magic in his descendants, and what would that look like? You know, that sort of thing. There's always a jumping off point. In Sisters of the Winterwood, it was like, well, what if I put Yiddish into my novel? And what if, you know, Goblin Market was set in the shtetl, you know, and like, Right. And so what would that look like? And then like, where was my family from? And what was that town like? And what was the forest around that town like? Both of our books also like there's so much, somebody goes missing in a forest, right? And then everything happens, everything goes from there. So yeah. I think I will always write something. There will always be history in the books that I write.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and I always for me, it's like trying to discover. I actually kind of approach it like, okay, what do I want to learn next? Now, it's so funny that we hadn't even talked about this. I have an MA in English. I did not get an MFA. I have an MA in English from George Mason, and it was kind of a little bit of like a design your own program. So I did a lot of literary theory, which I was completely unprepared for because my undergraduate degree had been in writing, and so I did not read a lot of the greats. And so I took a year off to read everything I thought I was supposed to read. Did a ton of workshopping, never took a poetry class until I did happen to take something from Marie Howe. And I kind of left that program feeling workshopped to death. All you did was like literary fiction, short stories. And, I kind of thought that's what I wanted to do. So I ended up having this, like, it's a rural noir kind of, that you'd see Donald Ray Pollock writes a lot of that, Bonnie Jo Campbell. I mean, I, grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. And to me, that was very authentic. And I liked that. But what I watched and what I read and what I really loved to read were always historical fantasies, or, I love Supernatural, Sabrina, Buffy. I mean, that's what I craved. And that's the only thing I really watched. So I was like, well, why am I not writing that? And it was really interesting. Now, the character of Laura Barnes was from my novel that didn't sell. And I'm just very economical about this because, like, I don't have, like, I wasn't going to let a book go to waste. And so I was like, these are characters that I know really well, and I'm going to plunk them and put them into this situation and see where we go and mash it up and see. And a lot of it's just a challenge to yourself. I think you do the same thing. It's just like, can I do this? Can I do this? Can I actually pull this off? And there's like that moment of fear for me whenever I'm like, can I pull this off? And I don't know if I did or not, but there's definitely that. I'm definitely looking at that Jewish stigmata story a bit differently now and thinking like, but what if there was Jewish demonology? And like, could I do that now that I've done these two books, right? Now that I feel confident in my space of historical fantasy, and this is what I do, and this is what I do well, and I can mine, the sources, right? Like, the Sisters in the Winter Wood had a tremendous amount of sources of history, of stories about the town and the people, and Lay the Midnight Stars is like even more research, about, there's Romanian mythology, there's dragon mythology, there's Romanian, there's also Jewish. Like, I was fascinated by like, but what if there were Jewish dragons? What would those look like? And how could I do that in a way that felt authentic, in a way that felt like it wasn't too far a leap from the Judaism that I know, but still dragons. I remember I was actually at Highlights writing, because I spent 2 weeks at Highlights over the course of a year and a half, trying to sort of write and rewrite this book. And we were going to talk about second book syndrome. Oh yeah. Well, we can do that. We can do that. So actually, there's a question. I'm actually doing what I'm supposed to do here right now. Okay. So how did the writing experience between writing your debut novel and your second novel differ from Lois Young? That's a great, and any questions, what we're going to try to do too, if we can't get to all the questions, look over the next couple of days. We're going to try and answer them in Twitter. So if we don't get to your question today, we run out, we're going to do that. And just a little housekeeping. If you want to buy the books, there was a question here about where to find signed books. Can they get, in my case, Politics and Prose has, you can go to the link here goes to the Hachette website. But if you want my books, they're available at Politics and Prose. I have signed, that's my hometown bookstore in Washington, D.C. Rena, I don't know about you, where your books were signed.
As far as I know, I did 250 tip-in sheets for a limited edition with Goldsboro Books out of the UK. And as far as I understand, they were available for like subscribers in the beginning, but they might be available soon for the general public, but that's limited edition, only 250 copies. But people did get the Sisters. I mean, my mom was able to order Sisters of the Winterwood from Goldsboro. So right now that's what I've got that's available. And I'm definitely going to post that link on Twitter as soon as I hear that they're available for the general public.
I mean, and certainly if you want to send me a book, I'll of course sign. I mean, I'm very responsive to that kind of stuff on Instagram and Twitter. So, but it's easier probably to just get it from Politics and Prose. Perfect. So one of the questions, again, so how did the writing, this was one of the things we were going to talk about anyway.
The dreaded second book.
the dreaded, also known as the dreaded, yeah. So I think a little known, I mean, for me, woohoo, I get a book contract. This is amazing, and you work really hard to get the edits. I mean, you get like 7 pages of edits and you're like, okay, I agree with those. And it makes it a better book. You do the edits, then you're promoting the book and you're looking at the artwork and all that great stuff. And then all of a sudden you look up and you're like, oh, I have a book due when, and, and for me, it was like a year later. And there was this kind of like, oh dear God moment that I had. And that, again, that's why I kind of like looked at what I had. I was like, okay, well, these are characters that I know. But I think what happens is you have a couple years in which to perfect your first book, right. Which for me, I'm totally Ladies of A Witch in Time. And, that was a really complicated book to write. I took about 2 years to write it. And then, I had to pivot really quickly for Ladies. For Ladies, I had to pivot really quickly and get a draft done in 8 months. And so there was a little bit of fear. I mean, I don't know that I have ever been so frightened. I mean, of a book in my life as I was, because you don't have you're not going through your normal process. You're not going, you don't have an extended period of time to get it perfect. Right. And so you are up against a deadline. And I write 1,000 words a day when I'm in writing. I got that from National Novel Writing Month. I think it's a wonderful process. I try to just get those 60,000 words down for me by writing 1,000 words a day. And they're awful. My first drafts are terrible. And the book doesn't really start to kind of like come to shape for me until like the second or third
revisions.
Draft. Yeah.
Revisions.
I don't know about you, but I think we talked about you had a similar experience.
Yeah. So, I mean, Sisters of the Winter Wood, I'd been writing honestly on and off. I had notes dating back to 2006 and the book came out in 2018. But I didn't actually like sit down and start writing it until I had this idea. I pitched it to my agent and he was like, I love that idea. Go for it. But again, you've got sort of all the time in the world to make that happen. And then, so for me, I'd been writing a different book that I thought was going to be book 2. And I don't know, I was like, I'd been writing it for about 6 months on and off. I also agree. I don't always get to 1,000 words a day, but like when I'm in writing mode, like National Novel, it's not always, then I make my own National Novel Writing Month.
Right.
Any
month is a National Novel Writing Month, really.
But I sit down, a button chair and write as much as I can every day. As long as I write every day. Some days it's 200 and some days it's 3,000, right? But it's like, I have to just write every day. And if I don't, like, I won't let myself go out. Not that we go out anymore, anywhere, ever. But, I won't let myself, do anything fun until I've done like what I need to do, which is like give myself at least an hour in front of the computer, get words on the page. So yeah, that book 2, about 6 months into writing this other book, my editor, who at the time was Nivea Evans, who's now my editor as well, and is yours, was like, well, we kind of were thinking about another fairy tale retelling, like would be a better follow-up. And I'm like, right. And she's like, could you come up with an idea over the weekend? And I'm like, right, over the weekend. Okay. And I sat down with all these Andrew Lang, blue fairy book, red fairy book, violet fairy book. I sort of collect them, but my mom used to read me fairy tales from them when I was little, and was like, okay, well, my grandmother was from Romania and she used to light candles in a closet, and which like we generally associate with like conversos or like hidden Jews, like Spanish and Portuguese. What is that my origin? Where, like, let's do some research. And like, what if there was a Romanian fairy tale? And I remembered this story called Boys with Golden Stars, which is a Romanian fairy tale. And I went back and read it and I was like, well, this is really interesting. Golden stars, like Jewish stars, and it's Romanian, and fell down a gazillion rabbit holes and was like, all right, this is starting to take shape. In the end, I never figured out why my grandmother lit candles in a closet. But what I did figure out is that she's not, as far as we can tell, Spanish and Portuguese in origin. She is more like Hungarian, Slovakian. And so that led me to where my book ended up. and the story that I ended up telling. However, this book was supposed to come out in November 2019. And now it's April 2021. And it's not because of the pandemic that this book was delayed. It's because I was rewriting it about 5 or 6 times.
Well, I mean, it's so complicated. I mean, we were, there's a, I mean, we were talking about the fact that there are no primary texts that you had. I mean, I did have primary, and I was watching the Hemingway documentary last night on PBS. And I mean, obviously, because he's actually a minor character in my book. But I mean, I did have a fair amount of primary texts to use. You did not. I mean, you are 14th century Hungary. And I remember reading this and being like, oh my God, like that is so ambitious because I mean, you're on your own. And,
right. With Sisters of the Winter Wood, there was a what we call a Yizkor book, which is like the community, many of whom died in the Holocaust, had sort of written down memories. And there was a very thick, not every community has one. Not every community has a lot, has a thick one with a lot of information and not in Yiddish. I was lucky that the town that my grandfather came from, there was this Yizkor book. It was long. Most of it was translated into English from the Yiddish. Whatever wasn't, I was able to read and translate and figure out. I had so much primary source material to work with. Of course, not the women in the story, which is like one of the things we were talking about as well. Is, one of the things I love about writing historical fantasy is the ability to insert women into the story. And there are so many women in both of our books. But also, this story. So I did base it around Rabbi Isaac of Tirnau, or Rabbi Isaac of Tirnava, depends on who you talk to, because he had written this book called the Sefer HaMinhagim, which is the Book of Customs. And I was like, okay, well, there's a primary text. Like, I'm going to latch on to that and to his story. And he had a daughter who supposedly married the son of like a duke or the son of a duke. And I was like, okay, well, this is a story that I can tell. And of course you can't write, I don't think you can write about medieval anything without having a little bit of courtly intrigue. And here was my courtly intrigue. And so it all sort of spun, from there. Not that I'm not related necessarily to this rabbi, and my family comes from a sort of a different rabbi and his descendants, but it was something I could latch onto as a primary text, because otherwise, like what do you, I was looking at old medieval maps of forests. Of course, the forests aren't there anymore. They're gone. The ancient beech forests, and but I could figure out where they would have been and stuff like that. And so it was a lot more research in a lot of different ways. And at a certain point, I think that's why historical fantasy is so great, because you can, like I said, not just insert women into the story, but you have a lot more room to play. Because I'm not calling it historical fiction. Of course, I can insert like cloud dragons and magic and all that sort of stuff, but you also have room to play with the history, and to say,
Yeah, we both were saying yesterday too, history is unknowable. I mean, it doesn't matter, even if you have primary text, there are just certain things that are lost, and it doesn't matter, I mean, growing up in the 70s, there are things I cannot explain to people about the 70s, even if I tried, I mean, there are those things that are just kind of lost. And there's a question here about, there was so much happening in Paris in the 1920s. What was the original idea around the secret circus? I mean, for me, it was this idea that that was a great time to put a secret circus, because you had all the surrealism going on. You had all of these artists kind of gathering. And the idea, at one point, even, Hemingway says to Cecile, how do you do it? How do you trick everybody into this performance art? And the idea that like there really was a devil's circus there it fit perfectly, because people just kind of thought like they were just like, doing some kind of really extreme performance art. And so it fit perfectly in the fact that, then these people were kind of talking more about how they did it and what it meant. And we're kind of missing the point. And I actually kind of really wanted to locate it then. And, I do like for my books to have a modern day frame. And then approach, with The Witch in Time, it was, 4 different time periods. And I don't think I realized how ambitious that was at the time. I mean, people will say like, oh my God, like, how did you, I have to say it was not hard for me to approach it that way. I just had to get in the mind space for Belle Epoque Paris. I went to France. went to Paris, hired a Louvre guide. This is before the pandemic, hired a Louvre guide to take me around. And I think I mentioned to you, they have to have 7 years of training to be able to kind of do that. So we went around to the neighborhoods, up to Montmartre, over to Montparnasse, and really spent some time kind of figuring out what would have been the customs. For example, a woman could not walk down the street by herself in Belle Epoque, France, if she was a lady. And so, that informed the idea that I had Juliet dressing as a boy. There were things like that, kind of little details that you get. And then, Hollywood, the 1930s, I did the same thing. I hired somebody to, take me around for, Thelma Todd, Jean Harlow's houses, and he thanked me for not asking him to take him to Calabasas to see the Kardashians' houses, because those were all the tours he was doing. And, so you have and for the 70s, I wanted my 70s, and I wanted, Taos, and I wanted, kind of that Dennis Hopper Easy Rider kind of, time period for Taos when they filmed Easy Rider there. And so you had but that's the fun. And that was, kind of when I then was kind of looking for a new time period, I was like, well, it has to be someplace that, is kind of France-ish around maybe Belle Epoque, but I'd kind of done that. And I was like, let's bring it almost to the point where it's lost. The absurdity of it is lost on this group of intellectuals. And, and so that's kind of why I located it around there. And plus I always love to have, who doesn't love a fake painter? If I have more fake painters than,
it's fantastic. And it reads so real. I really, I looked it up. I was like, I've never heard of, is this, but that's the best part, when you think it's real, when it's written well enough to feel real. It's really neat.
Thank you. He's kind of based on Modigliani. And he kind of, I always have somebody in my head when I'm thinking about, who Emile Giraud would have been like. He had that kind of dreamy look that Modigliani had. And that's a really tragic story. I will also say too, and we talked a little bit about this, studying English literature all my life, when I got to, when I went to University of Pittsburgh and I had a program in French literature opened up a lot to me. I had never read it before, and it just was like a doorway to possibility. You had, I'd never read Proust. I'd never read Sartre. I'd never read, and just opening up all of that to me changed my writing and changed my reading a lot.
It's interesting, literary influences. So there also was, Sisters of the Winterwood was Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, which is my favorite poem, one of my favorite poems of all time. I was obsessed with it. And I'd always said it'd be so neat to see someone do this in a book. And I know that a lot of people have riffed off of it over the years, but it took me a while to figure out what was what could I bring to the story? How could I retell this in my way? And at first, when I first started writing the book, I'd set it in a French forest called Blessed. And then eventually, I woke up in the middle of the night and I was like, Yiddish, Romania, wait, this could be set in the shtetl, the forest, I know where to do. I know exactly what to do, and all of a sudden, because I'd just been writing it and I hadn't located it somewhere. And actually, so I'm answering question. But somebody was saying, what's the spark that got you started with this book? We talked about a little bit about that, but how much and what kind of research did you do, locations, characters, all that kind of thing. So once I found the place, it was everything else fell in line. And the same thing happened with Light of the Midnight Stars. I was trying to find a place, and I was also tracing my grandmother's family back. Where were they from before that? And where were they from before that? And but what about before that? And then I found this town of Trnava. I don't think that my family was from there. They were from a town nearby, but it's near Bratislava, which is nowadays Slovakia, but was then part of the Hungarian Empire. And again, once I found the town, I found a map of the town. And there were these different gates, like the Melzanika gate and the St. Vicky, and it showed the woods and the forest. And I was like, okay, I have a map. Now I can put my people in that map. And I can pick a place where they're, what were the churches like in the 1400s, and what bells might they have heard, and what were the customs. And then, definitely it was always set in that time period, but then the pandemic happened. And so the Black Plague and blood libels and all of those things are part of, Jewish history as well. But it felt really, alive and real to be sort of writing about this black mist creeping in. And so I think that every author will tell you, it's like a confluence of all these things that come together to, you have your little spark, but then it's and so I also was reading a tremendous amount of Romanian literature to sort of situate myself in like the folklore and in the mythology and Mihai Eminescu, who's one of like Romania's foremost poets, has this Luceferal poem, which is about a girl who falls in love with a star or a comet or a man who falls from the sky. And one of my favorite books is Neil Gaiman's Stardust, and which is about there's a girl who falls from a star who's female who falls from the sky. And I was like,
I know that one. Yes,
that's really cool. Like I could do this comet guy who falls from the sky, and play with that. And so it all just starts to come together. But definitely, like, I think that literary, in both stories, I was very heavily influenced, like you were, by specific, literary texts that other people wrote that I was like, oh, this is a part of my story too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, A Witch in Time was Jean-Paul Sartre's No Exit. It was three people trapped in hell together for period again and again and again. And that was, remains my favorite book, or I guess it's play. And I saw the note here. It's so funny about love those middle of the night insights. So I think when you press and you're writing all the time, your mind starts kind of processing things in the background. And I remember for A Witch in Time, waking up, I was at the Roosevelt Hotel. And, there's certainly something like you kind of put yourself in, it's historic, it's 1930s. I went there specifically to try and kind of like channel the 1930s, and woke up in the middle of the night, and the entire back half of A Witch in Time came to me in one giant dream, and I remember the only thing I had was my phone. And so on a note, I just started. And when I plunked that out and put it into the actual document and like had the whole outline, and it just came in like one big like dream kind of like moment. And it was, I think, like 3,000 to 4,000 words that I just had done on a note in like, on my iPhone. And, but I do think that it's the actual work that you do every day that allows those types of things to just open up. You got to sit down, like we talked about, get your butt in the seat. And every 200 to 300 word day, when you're like, oh, I'm so frustrated, you do get those like moments of like uncapped magic that that comes to you. And so like middle of the night moments, I mean, I think my brain solves I need to get my character from here to there, or I don't know how to do that. Your brain solves those problems for you. At least mine does, if I just kind of give it a little bit of space.
Yeah. I remember at a certain point, Nivea had asked me Nivea, my editor, for those who may have not joined us from the beginning, who's also Constance's editor. Yep. She was like, well, what if you did some epigraphs, like from a text, And I called a dear friend of mine who's a rabbi and was like, what would can I write my own holy book? Like, what would it look like? Is that okay? I'm not going to like burn in hell for doing that, and so I started to work on this holy book, and there were so many incarnations of it. It was based on this book of customs that this rabbi wrote, but also just pulling from a million different texts and my own stuff, adding my own, stories, etc. And then I took it all out. And then there was a version that I put something else back in, which was like more like a framing narrative, which the book still has now, which was like a story. And I was like, well, maybe those will be the epigraphs. And then I took all those out. And then I wrote the draft of the book without either of those things. It's just like, oh, just cut 10,000 words from the book. Oh, just put them back in. And then in the final draft, it all came together. And I was like, oh no, I'm going to put the epigraphs back in. Yeah. And I know exactly how to do it. And I know where they're going to go. And I know what's missing. And it's going to make sense now. But that's the nitty gritty of the, like, you've got the burst of inspiration, right? But then you've got the, like, I'm going to cut. And speaking of which, my book actually was originally set in the present and the past. I had written it in 6 perspectives, which,
right.
Ambitious, a little too ambitious. And I ended up cutting all the modern stuff out and only doing the historical. So kudos to you for being able to maintain, the present and past and the back and forth and still make it make sense. I think it was just too much for me. Cut 50,000 words from the book and like start over again, and so inspiration only does so much. Ultimately putting a book out into the world is like butt in chair and cutting 10,000 words and putting it back in and rereading the whole thing. And and somehow in the end, you know, it all comes together with the guide of a good editor, but also, you know, our own brains finally eventually figure it out.
Well, a lot of times too, like Nivea will like give you some suggestions, but I mean, you know, you have to figure it out as the writer. And I just remember, you know, in both books, I struggled with something. So in the first book, Sarah was still my editor. Sarah Guam was still my editor for that, and she did not care for it wasn't even the house section. She did not care for that portion, and she did not think it matched the others. She was not wrong. And I spent more time going through that and redoing that. And if you all have read A Witch in Time, that's a really that time frame jumps in a weird way, but I think it was essential to get the ending. In this book, it was Cecile's journals. I think Nivea really kept pushing me that she felt the journals were falling flat. Now that I'm finding, you know, you have Laura's story, but then you also have her grandmother. It's kind of a trope, her grandmother's journals that she finds, but they're handed to her by a circus monkey. And so you have the journals where, you know, and the thing is, and you know, when you write journals, you can't really write a journal. It's got to be so I crafted them more like a memoir, because otherwise journals are pretty awful to read. I mean, and so you have to kind of like fake a journal as like a memoir. Mm-hmm. And so I worked the hardest on those parts, and I do see that people like Cecile's story the best. Like I've had a lot more feedback that like those are that really brings Paris alive to people. But again, I had to work really hard on those. There's always something I think you struggle with in a book, and a good editor will guide you through that. But also you got to solve those problems. Hey, so one of our questions is about siblings. So Rena, do you have siblings, and did you draw any of your sibling experiences for your book?
So I have one sister and one brother. One sister who's 10 years older than me. I'm the baby of the family by a lot. My sister is 10 years older than me. I have one brother. He's 9 years older than me. And then there's me. I was not an afterthought. My parents actually struggled with infertility for years. They had my brother and sister really close together, and my mom was in a horrible car accident, and they were told they couldn't have kids. And so they weren't even really trying, like 9 years later. And then my mom thought she had a stomach virus. And miraculously it was me. So I had kind of like a second mom in my sister, and my brother, not so much, just because of his personality. But for years, I sort of idolized her and looked up to her. And then like things changed as we got older, as we got married and had kids and stuff like that. You know, all of a sudden balance sort of shifted. I also got married before she did, which was weird, I think, for her. And, but, you know, we've had a very close relationship throughout. Just it's changed a lot, I think. in a lot of different ways. And so it definitely enables me to write about sisters, because I have a sister. But honestly, the reason I put siblings and sisters specifically into my books is because I want to insert women into the story. And the more siblings I have, the more sisters I have, the more women I can put back into history. Because, you know, throughout history, the people who were writing down the stories were men. And like those first person narratives, if you find them, they're generally written by men. You know, in more recent history, maybe, you know, you'll be lucky, but to find something. But for most of history, that's who wrote down the stories. And so the only way that we sort of have to reclaim like what women's lives would have been like, or what women's stories would have been like, is to invent them. And the more sisters I have, the more women I can sort of invent. That's Absolutely. Really where it comes from for me.
Yeah, no, we didn't even talk about this. My brother's 18 years older than me. My sister is 11.
Oh.
And like the same thing. Yeah, it's like,
there you go.
Yeah. And
clearly.
Yeah, no, I definitely think, you know, writing, you know, the siblings in mine, they are opposites, and they do not get along at all. And I think that, you know, I have a great relationship with my sister. And so, I mean, I think that actually kind of informed how to create a not great relationship with my, in the sisters. But so, but I think you're right, you know, especially for sisters, you know, back when in the time of your writing, it would have been familial, you know, because people didn't really interact with a ton of people. So like sisters were probably the most common bond that you're going to have in a family, and the most people that you're most likely to run into, especially in the woods in 14th century. So, yeah, that's great. Let's see.
I lost Constance. I'm going to keep going. What is it about the subgenre which led you to write your stories, history, the fantasy, the folklore. For me, it was definitely the combination of all three. Oh, we got you back.
I know. I knew it was going to happen.
I jumped to one of the questions.
Excellent.
What is it about?
I hit a button. I hit a double button, Ellen. It's a double button.
You're back. What is it about this subgenre which led you to write your stories? Was it history, fantasy, folklore, a combination of all three? So definitely for me, it was a combination of all three. I think we touched a bit upon that. The history, the fantasy, the folklore. For me, there's always a jumping off point. So like in Sisters of the Winter Wood, I found there was a story, really well-known story about the Spuller Zadie, who was this rabbi who danced in a bear cloak to save a fellow Jew. And there's a song that goes along with it, like, and a dance, and it's commonly told, I think, in like Hasidic circles. I grew up hearing it. My dad was always a storyteller. He was always telling stories. And so I was like, well, it's not that much of a leap to have somebody, dance in a bear cloak versus dancing in a bear cloak and turning into a bear. And so there's always the story, and then there's the jumping off point for the story. And that's how fantasy sort of happens for me. And in this book, it was like, okay, there were these Solomonars who there's a Romanian myth, and some people say it was an anti-Semitic trope, that these red-haired mountain men and women lived in the forest, and they would ride cloud dragons in the sky and control the weather. That's the anti-Semitic part about it, because Jews were very often, throughout history, accused of controlling the weather. Sometimes it came from a place of, we build these huts on Sukkot, and we sort of shake a palm frond and a lemon-like fruit that's a citron up at the sky. And it is around the time that the rains come. And so we do not control the weather, but we definitely shake strange things at the sky and build huts outside around the time that it starts to rain. And so that's sort of like, people talk about the origin of these Solomonars and that the myth that they may control the weather and ride cloud dragons in the sky in order to control the weather. And I was like, okay, but what if we turn that on its head? What if my rabbi, was the one who actually did ride cloud dragons in the sky because he had a legacy of magic in his blood from King Solomon? And what would that look like, right? What if? Mm-hmm. And I think fantasy is always the realm of what if. Absolutely. We talked about this with your demonology, right? Like, yeah. I mean, I love everything Lucifer. So like your book was definitely like, it fit that bill for me so much. I remember the movie Dogma, and I love, I even love like, The Good Place, because it's questions about like what is good and what is evil, and what is heaven and what is hell, and what does it mean to be good, and and Lucifer does that, and your book Good Omens, your book fit into that so well. And you talked a little bit about that, something similar in terms of like choosing which demon and how you went about choosing.
So I'm a little superstitious. It's superstitious in that you do not name a demon, and so I created my own. But I mean, my demons have kind of like a Lord Byron kind of, romanticism to them. And, and that kind of was a tone that I wanted it to have almost like a Victorian steampunk kind of like feel to him, to Althakazar. And he was a minor character in my first book. He's the demon that Juliet's mother uses to cast the spell. And so you see him all briefly, and, so he kind of has a much bigger role in book 2. But I mean, and, talking about like the best scenes to write, for me, any scene that Althakazar was in was my favorite scene. So I did kind of a mashup of multiple demons to kind of get him, and then the idea of him, having sticks as as part of his like real estate in hell, to me was, because that gives him so much power. And so, and then here he has, these daughters, and it's, and the kind of what happens as a result is, I like the big idea, but I also love things that get in motion that cause other things to happen. I really look for those because I love that kind of snowball effect of things that, and I think both of my books are about like, quests of women, one through time and one through the underworld, to find answers and to come to terms with the magic and who they both are. But yeah, no, I mean, I think for me, any scene that he's in is, I just had a smile on my face every time I had him in a scene, because you just never quite know what he's going to do. He's kind of crazy. He's kind of not. He's like, he's like scary. scary and not scary and humorous, and the fact that he's kind of humorous lets you let your guard down and you think, okay, he's kind of fun, and then the best, I mean, for me, the best scene was the fun that I had writing the demon Wikipedia article. It was like a demonpedia. And I mean, it was just, a lot of fun for me. So, I mean, you got to have fun when you write these books too.
Yeah, I definitely, for me, my favorite scenes, my favorite voice of the sisters to write was Levana, because I felt this way also about in Sisters of the Winterwood. Also, my favorite sister to write was, I think I enjoy writing the person that I'm not. Like, I'm not sort of flighty and like person who looks up at the stars, and I love stars and I love looking at them, but I tend to enjoy writing like the flighty sisters, I think, because they're sort of not who I am. The sister I struggled the most to write was Sarah, because I think she is the most like me, the fire starter. I'm an Aries, and it took me a really long time to sort of find her voice. Also because so my book is written in 3 perspectives, right? One is Levana, who falls in love with the stars, a star, or an actual star. Yeah. One who sort of her sections are written in the past tense and also in a journal-like form. Right. That's another thing that our books share. Yeah. And then the third sister, who sort of she doesn't have any bells and whistles. Like, she's just herself, and she's trying to figure out who she is. And she is the least confident sort of in her abilities of the 3 sisters. And she was the hardest to put on the page because she didn't have the format of the journal or the poetic language and the stars and the flightiness, and then eventually, so she also, like, Levana was in verse, but then not in verse, and then it was back in verse. And then she sort of in the end turned into like what she is now, which is mostly not verse. Yeah. But as her character arc sort of disintegrates, she sort of falls apart into verse, which sort of to me also felt like constellations and the way it looks on the page is very, and there are places in the book also that it's formatted in a certain way that to represent sort of stars falling and her falling apart. I don't know, those were like the easier chapters for me to write, the more fun chapters. I think because they're like poems, you just have an ability to have a lot more fun with language on the page. Yeah.
And your book surprises you too. Like, I don't know about yours, but like my Edward Binghamton Barrow character was a minor character, and then toward the end, he is the character that matches Laura the most, and which leads to a very interesting ending. Right. But like, you find those, I mean, I think there's definitely magic going on in a book where your book kind of like takes on a life of its own and like speaks to you. I would imagine that would be especially in the case with yours, when you have so much going on, you have all these characters to kind of like find that, like, I mean, did a character surprise you? Was there like one that you started off like thinking a little more minor, and it was like they kind of just kept knocking, on your laptop saying, "Write me more." I don't know
about that so much, but because I struggled so much to write Sarah and to constantly figure out like, who is she and what is her magic and what is her story arc and how does she find herself again? And she's the one who's sort of like, I mean, I think Hannah and Levana, I mean, they're all complex stories, but they have more, it's more defined, to me it was at least, whereas her narrative just felt so undefined. Like, I just kept, and I think it was part of my own discovery. Like, I think we're always trying to figure out who we are. Like, we're always constantly asking ourselves, and we're always different people at different stages in our lives. And so even the places where she sort of becomes like this fire, like dragon, like serpent, like thing, where she sort of shifts into like, it's almost like a phoenix, which wasn't exactly what I had in mind. I was more going towards there are like sort of biblical fiery serpents that take to the skies, which are in a lot of like the end of days, stories. That's kind of what I was latching onto. Cause again, I'm always like mining the sources for like, okay, if there's going to be a Jewish dragon, what is it? Where does it come from? The sources? What, and then I'll play with it. And so I didn't really expect that to happen. And then I was like, okay. And I remember I was at Highlights and I went to dinner or breakfast before Corona times when you could still be with people and eat with them and stuff like that. And people were like, so, and there's always writers there. And it's a wonderful, wonderful place. It's a retreat center. It's, generally more for kidlit books, both of these books actually, well, my first book started out, I thought I'd written a YA novel, and then it ended up selling as adult. And my characters are all teenage girls in their, 13, 15, 17. I think a lot of people tend to sort of comment on that because it's like, it's an adult fantasy novel, but my characters are all teens. But in those days, like when people's lifespans were much shorter, it was really common, at least certainly in Jewish communities, because those are what I studied, for girls to get married as young as 12.
Yeah,
like it was,
wow. Yeah.
so it is authentic to the time period. But anyway, and so I remember I came to this meal at Highlights and I was like, they're like, how is your book going? And I'm like, there might be dragons. Like there might actually, I think I'm actually writing dragons, like, and that was something that was sort of always there in the background. Like, am I going to play with it? Is it like, is he writing is it a cloud? Is it a dragon? And then I was like, no, there are going to be dragons. And that sort of like, that was a moment that came later on in the book writing process.
Well, we have a question here, and we could probably take another question of somebody. Are there limits to things? I mean, in historical fantasy, things readers won't accept. I mean, dragons, clearly people will accept dragons. I mean, I think the answer to that is probably no, if well written.
Right. There's a willing suspension of disbelief that you have to have in any book. Even if you're just writing fiction about what happened yesterday, it's still, truth is stranger than fiction. It has to be, you have to write it in a believable way.
Completely. I think if well written, I think there are a lot of, and certainly in Ladies of the Secret Circus, I mean, I pushed, it's a weird book. I mean, it's all the rides, what they mean, what they stand for, all of the performers. I mean, I just kept trying in that book to push the envelope as much as I could on how weird I could make it and how it, and so, yeah, I mean, I think as long as I think people perceive it as being well written, I think that they will accept a lot, because I think the kind of the more fun, the more you push, the more fun. And we talked a little bit about, just like the pressure, going back to book 2, just the pressure that you have to kind of, I thought A Witch in Time was a very ambitious book. And so I felt very nervous about whether or not I could deliver on the second one and make it like, and match it. There is such pressure always.
Such pressure. I kept hearing like the lines of reviews in my head as I was writing book 2, ambitious and surprising, gorgeously rendered. And I was like constantly like, is this book gorgeously rendered? Is this book ambitious and surprising? And that was, the thing that was sitting here the whole time, which is a horrible way to write a book, Oh no, I lost Constance again. Okay. I will move on to what's something that you read, watched, listened to lately that you loved, which is our last question. Okay. Well, I read Constance's book, which I loved. I'm answering the last question. I also really enjoyed Erin Morgenstern's The Starless Sea. I feel like I keep going back to that. Susanna Clark Piranesi, also both those books have been amazing. I also think they kind of speak to each other in different ways. Really, really enjoyed both of those recently. What have you been reading?
So I'm in the back half of your book. I have also been reading The Lost Apothecary. I kind of jumped on that bandwagon and really liked it. And The Arctic Fury, because I'm a big Greer McAllister fan. So, and I just am fascinated that somebody, as I said this to her, I did an event with her last week. To set something in the Arctic just is fascinating to me. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Great.
Right. Well, it was really great doing this with you, Constance.
Yeah, it
was my first official book event for this book, which is coming out in 2 days. And I'm so glad that I got to read your book and talk to you about it, because there was so much in common between,
there really was, and things we didn't even talk about. This was really great. So thank you. And thank everybody, for spending their Sunday with us. This is, we don't normally do events on a Sunday afternoon. So for us, although it's for you, it's Sunday night.
For me, it's Sunday night.
Absolutely. And you have an event to go off to. So this is good. So
I'm doing a little bit of a book launch in my backyard, socially distanced with a small number of people, but I'm really looking forward to it, to finally being able to do that.
Oh, that's great. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your Sunday. And thank you. Yes. Thank you.